Have you ever found yourself constantly walking on eggshells around someone you care about, wondering why every conversation feels like navigating a minefield? The answer might lie in understanding how avoidants weaponize the negativity bias against you, turning your brain's natural protective mechanisms into tools for emotional control. This psychological manipulation runs deeper than most people realize, creating patterns of confusion and self-doubt that can persist for years. The negativity bias exists in every human mind as a survival mechanism. Our brains are hardwired to notice, remember, and react more strongly to negative experiences than positive ones. This made perfect sense when our ancestors needed to remember which berries were poisonous or which paths led to danger. But in modern relationships, this same bias becomes a vulnerability that emotionally avoidant partners can exploit, often without even realizing they're doing it. When someone with an avoidant attachment style feels threatened by intimacy, they unconsciously activate your negativity bias through calculated emotional distance, criticism disguised as honesty, and strategic withdrawal of affection. They create just enough negative experiences to keep your brain focused on what's wrong rather than what's right. The cruel genius of this approach lies in its subtlety. It's never obvious enough to call out directly, yet persistent enough to reshape your entire emotional landscape. Think about Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl and her complicated relationship patterns. While Blair herself wasn't necessarily avoidant, she often dealt with partners who would create uncertainty through mixed signals. One day they'd shower her with attention, the next they'd become mysteriously distant. This push and pull dynamic triggers the negativity bias because your brain starts scanning for signs of rejection, interpreting neutral behaviors as negative, and catastrophizing small conflicts into relationship-ending disasters. The confirmation bias works hand in hand with the negativity bias in these situations. Once your brain decides that something is wrong, it starts looking for evidence to support that conclusion while ignoring evidence to the contrary. An avoidant partner's brief text responses become proof they're losing interest rather than simply being busy. Their need for alone time becomes rejection rather than self-care. Your mind becomes a detective building a case against your own relationship satisfaction. But here's what makes this dynamic particularly insidious: the intermittent reinforcement schedule that avoidant partners naturally create. Just when your negativity bias has you convinced that things are falling apart, they'll provide just enough warmth or connection to reset the cycle. This pattern actually strengthens the neural pathways associated with anxiety and hypervigilance, making you more sensitive to negative cues over time rather than less. Understanding this manipulation isn't about villainizing people with avoidant attachment styles. Many of them learned these patterns as children when emotional unavailability was their only option for psychological survival. However, recognizing these dynamics is crucial for protecting your own mental health and breaking free from cycles that erode your self-worth and emotional stability. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Picture this scenario that plays out in countless relationships every single day. Sarah had been dating someone for 8 months when she started noticing a pattern that made her question her own sanity. Every time their relationship seemed to be deepening, every time she felt truly connected and happy, something would shift. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. That would have been easier to identify and address. Instead, it was death by 1,000 paper cuts. A slightly dismissive tone when she shared exciting news about her promotion. A step backward when she reached for his hand in public. Conversations about future plans that somehow always got redirected or postponed. The most maddening part wasn't what he did, but what he didn't do. He never quite matched her enthusiasm, never quite met her emotional energy, never quite seemed as invested as she felt. Sarah's brain, designed to keep her safe from rejection and abandonment, began cataloging these micro-rejections with scientific precision. The negativity bias transformed her from someone who naturally saw the best in people into someone who couldn't stop analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings. She started wondering if she was being too needy when she wanted to spend weekends together. She questioned whether she was being clingy when she called to share good news. Her own emotions began to feel like character flaws rather than natural human responses. But the real psychological warfare began when Sarah tried to address these concerns directly. This is where the gaslighting element often enters the picture, though it's rarely intentional manipulation. When confronted with the impact of their emotional unavailability, avoidant partners often respond with confusion or defensiveness that makes the other person feel like they're overreacting or being too sensitive. Sarah's partner would point out all the things he did do for her. He was reliable, he was faithful, he cared about her well-being. These weren't lies or manipulations. They were genuine expressions of how he experienced love and connection. But they completely bypassed Sarah's actual emotional needs while simultaneously making her feel ungrateful for wanting more. The anchoring bias made these baseline behaviors seem like they should be enough, even when they left her feeling emotionally starved. The availability heuristic began working against Sarah as well. Because the moments of emotional distance were more frequent and memorable than the moments of genuine connection, her brain started treating emotional unavailability as the norm and genuine intimacy as the exception. She began to expect less and appreciate crumbs of affection as if they were full meals. What Sarah didn't understand at the time was that she was experiencing the psychological phenomenon known as trauma bonding. The unpredictable mixture of emotional withdrawal and occasional warmth created an addictive cycle where the relief of reconnection felt more intense than it would have in a consistently secure relationship. Her dopamine system was being hijacked by the very inconsistency that was causing her pain. The breaking point came during what should have been one of their best weekends together. They had planned a romantic getaway, and for the first day and a half, everything felt perfect. Sarah allowed herself to relax into the connection, to believe that maybe she had been overthinking things, that maybe this was just how he showed love. Then, without warning or explanation, the emotional wall went back up. He became distant, distracted, almost cold. When Sarah asked what was wrong, he insisted nothing had changed, that she was being too sensitive, that he was just tired. The gaslighting wasn't malicious, but it was devastating. Sarah found herself apologizing for her own emotional reactions, while simultaneously questioning whether her perceptions of reality could be trusted. This is the moment when the negativity bias becomes truly weaponized, when you start to see your own emotional needs as the problem rather than recognizing the dynamics at play. The resolution of this story won't come in the way most people expect, because real life rarely provides the clean endings we see in movies. But understanding what was happening gave Sarah the power to make different choices about how she responded to these patterns, and that's where the real transformation began. The first step in protecting yourself from this dynamic is developing what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. When you notice your negativity bias being triggered, pause and ask yourself whether you're responding to actual threats or to the absence of positive reinforcement. This distinction matters more than most people realize, because it's the difference between addressing real problems and chasing ghosts. Start paying attention to the pattern of your own emotional responses rather than just the intensity of them. Are you constantly seeking reassurance? Do you find yourself analyzing text messages like they're ancient hieroglyphs? Are you making excuses for someone's emotional unavailability while simultaneously feeling responsible for fixing it? These are signs that your negativity bias is being activated by someone else's attachment style rather than by genuine relationship problems. Here's a practical exercise that can help recalibrate your perspective. At the end of each day, write down 3 things that went well in your relationship and 3 things that concerned you. Most people in these dynamics will struggle to identify the positive moments because their brains have been trained to focus on what's missing or wrong. This isn't about toxic positivity or ignoring real problems. It's about gathering accurate data instead of letting your negativity bias control the narrative. The next crucial step involves setting what therapists call relational boundaries. This doesn't mean building walls or becoming emotionally unavailable yourself. Instead, it means recognizing that you cannot control another person's attachment style or emotional capacity, but you can control how much of your own emotional well-being you're willing to sacrifice in the process. Think of it like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris, trying to navigate Gabriel's hot and cold behavior. At some point, she had to decide whether the emotional roller coaster was worth the occasional highs. Practice what's called the 24-hour rule when you notice your anxiety spiking about relationship dynamics. Before sending that long text, explaining your feelings, before having that serious conversation about where things are going, give yourself a full day to see if the crisis feeling passes. Often, what feels like a relationship emergency is actually your negativity bias responding to normal fluctuations in connection and intimacy. Learn to distinguish between your anxiety and your intuition. Anxiety tells you stories about what might happen based on past experiences and current fears. Intuition gives you information about what's actually happening right now. If someone consistently makes you feel like you're asking for too much when you express basic emotional needs, that's information worth trusting. If you find yourself constantly explaining why you deserve basic respect and consideration, that's intuition telling you something important about the dynamic. But here's where this gets more complex than simple relationship advice. You also need to examine your own role in perpetuating these cycles. Are you attracted to emotionally unavailable people because chaos feels more familiar than security? Do you mistake anxiety for love, interpreting the stress of uncertainty as proof that you care deeply? Many people who end up in these dynamics have their own attachment wounds that make them particularly susceptible to this kind of psychological manipulation. The fundamental shift requires moving from trying to earn someone's consistent love and attention to expecting it as a baseline requirement. This doesn't mean becoming demanding or high maintenance. It means recognizing that healthy relationships involve 2 people who are genuinely excited to be with each other, not one person constantly trying to convince the other to show up emotionally. Consider how Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You uses people's insecurities and need for validation against them. While that's an extreme example of manipulation, the underlying dynamic, exploiting someone's negativity bias to maintain control, shows up in much subtler ways in everyday relationships. The antidote isn't becoming suspicious of everyone, but rather developing a strong enough sense of your own worth that inconsistent treatment feels unacceptable rather than normal. Start practicing what's called secure functioning in your own life. This means becoming the kind of partner you want to attract, emotionally available, consistent, direct about your needs, and willing to address problems constructively rather than avoiding them. When you operate from a secure base within yourself, you become less susceptible to having your negativity bias weaponized because you're not constantly scanning for threats to your worth or lovability. The most powerful protection against this dynamic is developing what researchers call earned security. The ability to create secure attachment patterns even if you didn't learn them in childhood. This involves learning to self-soothe when your anxiety spikes, communicating your needs clearly without attacking or withdrawing, and choosing partners based on how they make you feel about yourself rather than how they make you feel about them. Understanding how avoidants weaponize the negativity bias isn't about becoming defensive or building walls around your heart. It's about recognizing that your brain's natural protective mechanisms can be exploited by certain relationship dynamics, and that awareness gives you the power to choose different responses. The goal isn't to fix or change emotionally unavailable partners, but to become someone who no longer finds emotional unavailability acceptable or attractive. Your negativity bias evolved to keep you safe, but in modern relationships, it often keeps you stuck. When someone consistently triggers your anxiety about your worth, your security, or your future together, that's not love creating butterflies. That's your nervous system trying to tell you something important. The difference between healthy relationship growth and psychological manipulation often lies in whether conflicts bring you closer together or leave you feeling more uncertain about where you stand. The patterns we've explored today don't just affect romantic relationships. They show up in friendships, family dynamics, and even professional relationships. Anytime someone uses your natural human need for connection and security against you, whether consciously or unconsciously, they're weaponizing your negativity bias. The person who gives you just enough attention to keep you hoping, but never enough to feel secure. The friend who only reaches out when they need something, but somehow makes you feel selfish for having needs of your own. Think about Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl, and how she often found herself in relationships where her emotional generosity was taken for granted while her needs were treated as inconveniences. The pattern of giving more than you receive while feeling grateful for scraps of genuine connection is a telltale sign that someone is exploiting your attachment system rather than nurturing it. The journey toward healthier relationships begins with a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person love me consistently?" start asking, "Does this person's natural way of loving feel nourishing to me?" Instead of trying to decode mixed messages and hoping for change, start noticing whether someone's actions align with their words over time. Instead of making excuses for emotional unavailability, start recognizing it as information about compatibility rather than a challenge to overcome. This doesn't mean becoming harsh or unforgiving toward people who struggle with intimacy. Many individuals with avoidant attachment styles are genuinely trying their best with the emotional tools they developed to survive difficult childhoods. Understanding and compassion are important, but they shouldn't come at the expense of your own emotional well-being and security needs. The most profound realization for most people is that they have more power in these dynamics than they initially believed. You cannot control whether someone chooses emotional availability, but you can control whether you stay in relationships that consistently leave you feeling anxious, unworthy, or constantly seeking proof of love. You cannot force someone to meet your emotional needs, but you can stop settling for relationships where your basic needs feel like unreasonable requests. Moving forward, pay attention to how you feel in someone's presence over time. Do you leave interactions feeling energized and appreciated, or drained and uncertain? Do you find yourself making excuses for their behavior to friends and family? Are you constantly trying to figure out where you stand instead of simply enjoying the connection? These questions will tell you more about relationship health than any analysis of their words or promises for the future. The goal isn't to become invulnerable or to stop caring deeply about others. The goal is to care for yourself with the same intensity that you naturally extend to others. When you truly understand your own worth and refuse to accept less than genuine emotional availability, you'll find that the right people are attracted to your security rather than threatened by it. Remember that healing these patterns takes time, especially if they've been reinforced over years or decades. Be patient with yourself as you learn to trust your own perceptions and set boundaries that honor your emotional needs. Every time you choose to walk away from someone who cannot show up consistently, every time you refuse to accept breadcrumbs of affection as a full meal, you're rewiring your brain to expect better and creating space for the kind of love that doesn't require constant vigilance to maintain. Your negativity bias doesn't have to be a weakness that others exploit. It can become a strength that helps you identify and avoid relationships that drain your spirit. Trust yourself. Expect consistency and never apologize for having normal human needs for connection, security, and emotional availability. The right people will meet you there without making you feel like you're asking for too much.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.